Today's lecture on language knowledge will consist of two parts. In this first part of the lecture, we will review what we know when we know a language, and we will recap the subfields of linguistics that study this knowledge. Let's start by reiterating that when we learn our native language or languages, if we have more than one, we do it in a subconscious way. Linguists refer to a person's native language or languages as L1 or L1s if there are more than one of them. Subsequent languages are referred to as L2s. Because we acquire our native languages by being exposed to them in our environment from birth or very young age, we acquire the linguistic systems used around us. Therefore, what we acquire already conforms to the rules of these linguistic systems, although it takes a little while to figure out those rules from input. There are different theoretical approaches to explaining how language acquisition takes place. Some scholars hypothesize that we're born with a so-called universal grammar, a genetic code of sorts that allows us to acquire any human language we're exposed to in our environment from early childhood. Others postulate that repeated exposure to chunks of language, such as, "What's that?" or "I want apple," or "Mommy's sock," in their association with particular meanings or actions, strengthens neural connections between those language chunks and meanings in our brain. Still, other scholars proposed language models that rest basically on the fact that our brains are very complex computational machines. They're capable of processing input we hear and statistically, albeit subconsciously, calculating frequencies and probabilities of certain linguistic patterns. In this course, we are not going to focus on any particular theory yet. You may want to explore such theories in future courses. But it is important to remember that however we acquire our first languages, we do it subconsciously. As regular, ordinary individuals going on by our lives, we don't really know what we know and how we come by this knowledge. Linguists make it their job to figure it out, but they haven't yet found a definitive answer. But although we don't know how we know it, we know quite a bit about our native languages. First and foremost, we know how to make the sounds of our language. For example, we know what to do with our mouths to make the sounds th and the in the words such as thick and this. And we know these sounds are a little different because if somebody said thick or this, we'd immediately know that it sounds wrong. We know which sounds are not part of our native language inventory. How many an English speaker has struggled with the Spanish r sound? We hear sounds outside our language in foreign accents too. We also know which sounds do and do not go together. For example, most of us will think that a word like blothum is possible in English, even if we don't know what it means. But the word tlochboom sounds definitely non-English. Knowing how to make sounds of our language and perceiving these sounds as belonging to our language constitutes our knowledge of phonetics. And knowing how sounds pattern in our language constitutes the knowledge of our first language phonology. Furthermore, we know how to make new words in our language. We know, for example, that the suffix ment attaches to verbs, so we say entertainment from entertain and government from govern. We don't say entertainship or governhood. We realize that those two latter examples are not English words, even if we can't define what a verb is or have never heard the term suffix in our lives. We know how to change word forms in a sentence too. For example, if we say a cow jumped over the moon, we understand that it was one cow, and using cows would not be right, since that S or Z sound at the end of words beats more than one. We also don't say a cow's jumpin' over the moon, because past tense is formed by adding et to the end of the verb. Jump, not jumpin'. We know it, again, even if we have never ever heard of such a thing as past tense. You may say, but of course I heard of past tense and suffixes. I'm a college student. I remember learning something like that in elementary school. But Think of this. You already knew how to make past tense verbs or plural nouns long before you went to school. You knew this by the time you were 4 years old. In 1958, Jean Burko Gleason did an amazing experiment that showed when children acquired the word formation in their native English. She found that happened by about the age of 4. This was called a WUG test. We are going to make our own WUG experiment right now. Look at the picture of the people on this slide. They're doing something peculiar. Let's say these people know how to multon. This is what you see them doing in the picture. Now, how would you say what these people are doing right now? Pause the lecture for a second and say, they are... I bet you said multoning. I doubt there is even a single person among you who didn't come up with that form, even though those of you who acquired English as your native language, or one of your native languages, probably have no idea what this form is called. It's a progressive participle, by the way, but you don't need to memorize it right now. Now let's repeat the experiment with another form. Pause the lecture for a second, a couple of seconds, and finish this sentence. Yesterday, these people... You probably said multoned, because this is how you know we talk about the past. We add ed to the verbs. Some of you may have said were multoning, but then you changed are to were, knowing that were is the past tense of are. Finally, let's do this again with a different form. Here's the sentence. Which form do you think would fit in the blank here? Their friend Ivar, blank, every morning for healthy exercise. Chances are you said multones because it makes sense, so to say. It makes sense because as an English speaker, you have quite a sophisticated knowledge of how to build new words in English. In other words, you know the derivational morphology of the language. The change in word forms based on whether you are talking about one thing or many, about today or yesterday, and so on, also makes sense because you know the inflectional morphology of your native language. Not only do we know how to change words, but we also know how to string them together into sentences and utterances. For an English speaker, everyone should read Chaucer to improve their everyday vocabulary is a perfectly normal sentence. But vocabulary everyone improve every day should to read Chaucer there is a word salad, despite the fact that the words are all the same in both stretches. The rules organizing words into utterances and sentences are not the same across languages either. Let's compare English and Spanish, two languages most frequently spoken in our area. We say, Marla bought it. Whether we know what it is or not, it is an acceptable English sentence. But Marla it bought is not the right word order. We don't say Marla it bought. Notice that in Spanish, the rule is the opposite. Marla lo compro, literally, Marla it bought is acceptable, just how it should be in Spanish. But the word order that is the same as in English, Marla compro lo, would not be grammatical. Knowing how to arrange words in our language rests on our knowledge of syntax. Now let's talk about meaning. We know what words in our language mean. For example, in a sentence, he stepped gingerly onto the bridge, knowing enchantment awaited on the other side. We know what step and gingerly and bridge and all the other words mean individually, and how bridges are related to the notion of something being on the other side. We also know which words make sense together and which ones don't. My dog ate my homework makes sense, whether it is true or not that Fido chewed up your final paper. My TV ate my sandwich is nonsensical, because TVs are not the kind of entities that eat sandwiches or any other food. And the sentence, the wine was dry and crumbling in my hands, is problematic because although a wine can be dry, It is a different kind of dry than, say, bread, cookies, or sand. Wine, whether it is dry or sweet, does not crumble. Finally, we know what different utterances mean in context. When somebody says, "Can I borrow $5?" it is not merely a question. It is a request. And German chocolate cake, while perfectly grammatical, is not a good answer to the question, "What time is it?" The knowledge of word meanings and their combinations is the knowledge of semantics. And the knowledge of how to use language appropriately in different situations is pragmatics. It is important to note that we hold all of this knowledge subconsciously without being aware of it. This is called our language competence. We acquire the competence of our language over time, but it doesn't take very long. By the age of 4 or 5, the time we enter kindergarten, we already have quite a firm grasp on the phonetics, phonology, morphology, syntax, semantics, and pragmatics of our language. It is true that it may take a little longer for some kids to learn how to pronounce hard sounds like r or th, and to remember to say please and thank you when appropriate, but we don't go saying wabbit instead of rabbit for much longer than elementary school, and we do learn the rules of politeness. We don't ever stop acquiring vocabulary, though. But we don't simply store this tacit knowledge in our heads. We draw on it every day to go and do language in the real world, to greet people, to ask questions, to read books and backs of cereal boxes, to gossip, whisper sweet nothings to significant others, make class reports, and so on and so on and so forth. This ability to use language to speak and understand what others say is called linguistic performance. Our performance may vary from situation to situation. When we're tired or ill or intoxicated, we may slur sounds, make mistakes in speech, or have difficulties finding the right word. However, that does not mean that we suddenly forget our language. Our competence in our language remains intact. This completes our review of what we know when we know a language and of which linguistic subfields study this knowledge.